Hey everyone. So in today's lecture, we are going to be looking at natural propagation structures. And this is the first lecture in a series that is going to take us up to the end of the course. And what we're going to be focusing on is vegetative propagation. If you guys remember from the way beginning when we gave an overview, vegetative propagation is a form of asexual reproduction in our plants, right? It's essentially a way that our plants are able to create clones or copies of themselves, right? And this allows them to reproduce in a not relying on seeds, right? And that whole process of sexual reproduction that we talked about earlier. So, some of our plants have natural propagation structures, which we're going to be looking at today, right? These are structures that allow them to create daughter plants, right? So, copies of themselves. But we also, in vegetative propagation, we also take advantage of essentially the ability of many of our plants to regrow lost tissues, right? So, for the example, if we took a stem cutting, a lot of our plants have the ability to regrow a root system from that stem, right? And those are called adventitious organs, right? If we had a stem cutting and it regrows roots, those would be adventitious roots. A lot of our plants have this ability, and we're able to tap into that to reproduce or to create daughter plants through these methods, right? As opposed to having to rely on breeding or sexual reproduction or using seed plants or using seeds from our plants. So like I said, today we're going to be looking at natural propagation structures, and what we're going to be looking at are what I have listed up there, right? We're going to look at stolons, rhizomes, crowns, offsets, corms, bulbs, tubers, and tuberous roots. Seems like a lot, but it's not really that much. So I'm going to start with stolons.
So stolons are above ground horizontal stems. So if we have our plant growing here, and a lot of our plants have stolons, I think the strawberry is, okay, this is going to be a bad leaf. Strawberry plant is a really good example. So the strawberry plant will produce these stolons, which are these above ground horizontal stems. And at each node, so this is our stem going along here. I'll actually do a really long one. So at each of these nodes, it produces new stem and new adventitious roots. All right. So at each of these nodes, we can get a new strawberry plant that can grow up. Right? And in this way, it allows the strawberry plant to colonize and propagate itself vegetatively. We could take advantage of this and do division. So as this thing is growing, we can take cuttings here as we have these new plantlets growing up. So those are stolons, horizontal stems, and at the nodes along these stems, we get new plants that are produced.
All right. So similarly to stolons, rhizomes are horizontal stems, but the kind of two big differences. One, our rhizomes are primarily below ground, or they are below ground horizontal stems, right? Our stolons were primarily above ground or maybe just below the soil surface, but our rhizomes are below ground horizontal stems, and many of them, they will also act as storage organs, right? So they can store starches and nutrients that our plant needs to grow and survive. So when we're looking at rhizomes, we have several examples, well-known examples. Bananas will produce rhizomes and reproduce in that way. Cattails, which are a native wetland plant. Ginger, right? What we think of as ginger root, that is technically a rhizome. That is technically a stem that is growing here. Bamboo and hops also produce rhizomes. And what also produces rhizomes is this plant right here. So this is American beach grass. This is a very important plant that helps protect your dunes and establish your dunes in coastal environments. And you see this structure right here. This is a rhizome. So Normally, this plant is buried in sand up to about here, and it will produce these rhizomes. And from these rhizomes, along the rhizome, there are nodes. And at these nodes, there's one right here, there's one right here. This plant has the ability to produce new roots and new shoots at these nodes. So if we were going to propagate a structure or a plant like this, and we had new daughter plants growing at these nodes, we could simply clip these off at the rhizome here, plant them, and now we will have new plants that are growing from them. So those are rhizomes. Now, this beach grass is also going to help us illustrate crowns. So the crown, when we're talking about it in regards to propagation here, is the area where the stem of our plant joins the root, right? So this location right here would be the crown, where our stems are joining the root. Now, examples of plants that, and essentially what we're doing when we're talking about crown propagation or propagating using this is crown division. So we have the ability to divide the plant at the crown to produce new daughter plants. So we can do this with asparagus, right? That's common. You see the picture up there of asparagus, American beach grass, which we're going to do here. Many of our fern species we can divide through crown division, carnations as well. So essentially what you do, it's pretty simple. I'm going to separate these two, and we'll use this one. So at the crown here is that junction where our stem is meeting our roots. And all you do is you pull these apart, right? And that is division. So you can see there's kind of like two separate shoots that we have right here. So if we were going to be propagating this, you simply just kind of pull them apart. You try to include roots on both. And now we have two separate plants that we can then go and plant. If we were doing this outside, we would plant them on the beach about 2 feet apart or so. Or we could put these into containers in a outside or greenhouse environment. So very, very simple. Crown division. You are simply just separating the plant at this crown, this junction where our stems are meeting our roots. And you want to kind of make sure you try and keep roots on both sides. But that's crown division. Very easy. So next, we are going to be talking about offsets, which is kind of the larger term, and I got sand all over here now. Offsets are kind of the larger term, but you'll hear terms such as slips or suckers, and those are offsets. And these are essentially just daughter plants that are produced on a mother plant. So when we were just looking here with our rhizomes and our stolons, right, those daughter plants that get produced, right, if I pull up here again, if I had my beach grass and if I had a new shoot that was coming up here with some roots, this new daughter plant would be considered an offset or perhaps a sucker or a slip. I'm not entirely sure what's the definition between slips and suckers. I know just for some plants they call them slips, some suckers. I'm sure there is a definition. You guys can look it up. So they are a daughter plant that is produced on the mother plant. And typically the shoot, perhaps maybe this is the definition, that particularly the daughter plant arises from the base of the main stem of the mother plant. And we'll see that when we look at some pictures that I have up there, especially with our succulents. So I think that's probably the more technical definition, but we tend to refer to just any sort of lateral branches that arise from the main stem or from stolons or rhizomes as offsets. So examples of plants that produce offsets, again, bananas, blackberries, tomatoes. You've probably all, if you've grown tomatoes, you hear of tomato suckers, right? And succulents. So if you look, here are some examples. Right over here, this is a banana sucker. Right now, technically, there is a little rhizome down over here. And then from that rhizome, we have a new shoot that develops in our banana. And you'd be able to cut into the soil here, cut this sucker off, and then replant that, and that will grow into a new banana tree. Now, technically, there are two types of suckers that develop with your bananas. water suckers and sword suckers. And the water suckers have bigger leaves. You don't really want to use those ones. You want to use these ones more. Anyway, here is an apple tree, and these are suckers that have developed on this apple tree down here. So again, these are stems that are rising from the base of the tree, really that crown area. And these could be removed and replanted, and you would have new trees that develop. If we are looking at some succulents, here are some two different examples of succulents, and you see these what essentially look like miniature versions. They are miniature daughter versions of the mother plant that develop at the base of our succulents. Again, these could be removed and repotted, and they will develop into new plants. Here we have a tomato sucker. When we were talking about tomato plants, the suckers that are typically the new shoots that are developing in the axils of our plant. So the axil is this space here between the main stem and another branch. So you'll see new stems that develop in these axils, and those we refer to those as suckers. These can be taken off and replanted, and it will develop into a new tomato plant. And then here's our blackberry over here. Blackberry has stolons, and growing from those stolons, as we looked at earlier, are new plants, and those new plants are referred to as suckers. Again, these could be removed and replanted, and that's a nice way of propagating blackberries.
Now we're going to move and talk about corms. So a corm is an underground storage organ. It is really a swollen stem that is covered in leafy scales. Now the difference, they can look similar to the other type of underground swollen stem storage organs, which are bulbs, and we'll talk about bulbs in the next slide. But the difference, so we'll say, all right, so again, so we'll say this is our corm, this is our bulb. They have similar functions. How you tell them apart is if you cut these guys in half. If you look at a corm from top down, you will not see visible storage rings. Whereas if you look at a bulb, think of an onion, you will see those storage rings, right? So that's the difference between them. Again, they both are underground storage organs. They are both swollen stems. They act similarly. The idea is your plant grows a season. It then develops a corm at the end of that growing season. It stores up all these nutrients within the corm. And then the following year, it will produce a new shoot. So you'll have your corm here that so this is now going through the winter, and then in the following spring it's going to produce, it actually starts producing a new corm on top of the old one, and then your new shoot. Now another way that our corms can reproduce is they can produce these tiny little offshoots here called cormels. Right, so these are tiny little corms that if they get big enough, they can then be removed, and they will, you can grow a whole new plant from your cormel. Okay, so those are corms. So you have all seen bulbs before. This is an onion that has been left in my cabinet for a long time. So bulbs are specialized underground structures. They are stems, technically. So they consist of an inner stem that we'll kind of take a look at, that is surrounded by these modified leaves that we call scales. Right? And those scales are typically fleshy, and they contain reserved food materials for the plant. So our plants that produce bulbs are typically monocots, and there's some different types of bulbs, tunigate versus non-tunigate. We're not going to get into that. Really, what I want to show you today is just a type of propagation of our bulbs. So like I said, this guy has been in the cabinet for a long time. Our bulbs will naturally propagate, as you see here, in a number of ways. So there are, at the axles of these bulb scales, we can form what are called bulblets, and they will grow into the stem tissues. You can take your onions when you first get your onions, so just a little anatomy. So here is the top part of our bulb, that's where we have our stems growing through. Down here this is where our roots form, right? So they've all been trimmed off, but our roots are going to form from this bottom part down here. When you first get an onion, you can actually cut off this bottom section, take like where the roots are and about a quarter of it in terms of total length of your onion up, and you can plant that and you'll get new onion shoots that'll sprout up from there. We're going to divide this because we already have these nice shoots growing. So first thing, we can remove these outer layers, and we'll get to our actual onion now. So we're just getting rid of all that outer fleshy material, and we're going to be dividing this by division. So if you look, try and peel back some of this stuff for you guys to see. So if you peel back these layers, you should be able to see here how we have distinct offshoots, what they are called, that have developed. So these are stem sections that have developed from this main bulb, and they're now growing their own stem tissue. So we are going to divide them up. Actually, you see you have a nice root developing right there. I don't want to get rid of that. Make sure this root stays a root. Right, so we can essentially just break these off. Right, got a little section. It's got some of that root. It has an actual root already. So there's one. And we can divide. Keep on dividing. We should be able to split this one up too. Alright, so that one actually doesn't have much root tissue included, but we'll see how it does. And then this will be our 3. Oops, I ripped off some good roots. Whoopsie. Okay, so we got our 3 sections. We are going to plant them in this pot just like we would plant any sort of transplant. So let me adjust this. And you can see into the pot here. We're going to dig down a little bit. Just cover it up. Since I have 3, I'm going to plant 3 in my pot. See how they do. Okay, so they're all planted down in there. We're going to give these guys a little bit of water, and hopefully by the end of the season we'll have some new onions. Really simple.
So tubers. Tubers are modified, swollen modified stems, right? And our good example here is our potato. So these are technically stems, right? These are not roots. And they are essentially these swollen stolons or rhizomes. If you look down here, right, you have your stolon, that horizontal stem, and it develops into a swollen tuber. So our tubers are storage organs. They are storing starches and nutrients that our plants are going to use to regrow following winter, right? They die off. So our potato plant is growing. At a certain time, it starts producing these tubers that are going to store nutrients. Winter comes, the top part of our plant dies off. Following spring, we have new shoots that will develop from our tuber. Now, our potato has eyes, right? You're all probably familiar with the eyes of our potato. Those eyes are actually nodes that contain one or more small buds, and it's from these eyes or these buds that we can develop new shoots and new roots, right? So if you are propagating potatoes, typically we propagate using seed potatoes, right? So these are potatoes that we plant into the ground or a container potentially, and we have new potatoes develop, new shoots and roots develop from them. So if you're going to propagate a potato, it's important that you include at least 2 eyes in your cutting. So a lot of times if you have a bigger potato, you can cut them into sections and then plant those sections, and from them you will develop new potato plants. You want to make sure that you have at least 2 eyes in each cutting, and usually you want to have cutting pieces. You can have cutting pieces that are probably about half the size of this, right? So a rule of thumb is if you have a potato that is about the size of a large like chicken egg, which this is just about, you can get away with cutting this in half, right? So you can have 2 pieces. So I think it comes down to about like 1.5 ounces you want each of your seed potato or your cuttings to weigh. But if you don't want to actually weigh everyone, something you can get away with cutting this in half, and that would be good enough that you could then plant outside to propagate. So those are tubers, swollen, modified stems that are storage organs and will produce new shoots from them. And then lastly, we are going to look at tuberous roots. So there is a difference between our potatoes and our sweet potatoes, and the big difference is that our potatoes here, these are tubers and those are stems, whereas our sweet potatoes are tuberous roots. So they're actually root tissue as opposed to stem. So other plants that produce tuberous roots besides our sweet potato, or kind of common ones, are our dahlia, right? They also produce these tuberous roots, and they can be propagated in this way. So they have a similar function, right? They are enlarged secondary roots. Just like with our tubers, they act as storage tissue that will allow our plant to regrow following winter. Now, from our tuberous roots, they, just like kind of our tubers, similarly, they will produce new stem and root tissue from eyes, right, in our tuberous roots. But we propagate them differently. So if we are propagating sweet potatoes, unfortunately, I don't have one with me, but I'm going to pretend this is a sweet potato, and we're gonna use it. So our sweet potato, as you see here, the first thing you need to know is that it has 2 ends, right? So it has a proximal end, which is the end that's closest to the stem, and it has a distal end, which is the end that is further away from the stem, right, as you see here. Now, typically our proximal end, it's going to be the pointy end, where our distal end is going to be the more blunt, rounder end. And the potato, when we are growing new shoots, it will primarily grow new shoots, at least initially, from the proximal end. So that's something to be aware of if you're trying to grow new slips, they're referred to, in your sweet potato. Now, I have seen people do this different ways, and you'll see some resources that will say if you're trying to propagate, always propagate with the distal end or the proximal end in a certain way, because they'll develop your slips first. And I've seen people do it the opposite way, and it's worked out both ways. So there is some experimentation that you guys can do to see how it's done. But a common way that if you look on the internet, and maybe some of you have done this, to grow slips from your sweet potatoes is to use a jar and water. So again, we are going to pretend this is a sweet potato. And what you do is, let me see if I have, where do I have, do I not have toothpicks? Oh, here they are. Okay. So what you would do is, we're pretending this is our sweet potato, and say we have a proximal end, right, a pointy end, we'll pretend it's this. So you would fill your jar up with some water, and you want to submerge your sweet potato about halfway into the jar. Again, we're pretending here. And what you can do is you can use toothpicks or small little dowels to create a little structure that your sweet potato will sit in. So, right, you can do something like this. And if I had one more, I would put one more out there. And that's going to allow you to suspend your sweet potato in water. So again, let's use our imagination and pretend this is sweet potato first of all, and that's bigger. So maybe it sits down into here. And we have our water filled up. So about half of it is submerged in the water. And the idea is that over the next few weeks, you will start to see new shoots develop from the top of our sweet potato. And we refer to those as slips. And you could put this under a light or on a windowsill. Try and get it some good light. And from the bottom, you will start to see the sweet potato develop roots, right? And like I said, this is different from our tuber propagation or potato propagation. We can't just cut this and plant them. We need to develop those new slips and then plant those individual slips. So over time, you will have your new shoots develop. And then what you do is once they get to about 6 inches or so, maybe a little taller, you can cut them, right? You would cut your new shoots, and then you could plant them just like you did this in a jar of water, right? So you put them back in, you have your new shoots or your new slips as they're referred to, put them in another jar of water, let them sit for another week, maybe a couple weeks, and you'll see them start to develop roots. And once they develop roots, then they're ready to go and be planted outside or maybe in a container, wherever you're going to plant them. All right, so that's how you would develop or how you would propagate sweet potatoes. Now, you can skip this step, and you want to make sure you're changing your water about once a week when you're doing this. You can also kind of skip this, and instead of using this water method, you can just grow them in a container, right? You can use some sort of soil. You don't even need any sort of like nutritious or nutrient-rich soil because this is a storage tissue, right? It has all the nutrients it needs in here. So you can just grow them in sand, right? And you would lay them down horizontally in a container that you have filled with sand. You could put them about halfway in. And then just like if you were growing them in here, they will start growing slips on the one side. A trick that you can do as they're growing slips, you can pile more sand on, so you kind of hill it up like you would hill a potato, and they'll start developing. So if you have your slip growing here, you hilled it up with some more sand. At the nodes along this new shoot, they will start developing roots. So you can get a whole slip that has our shoot and our roots attached, and then you would cut that off and then you can replant that. So a way of propagating sweet potatoes. So that should be it, right? Those are our different natural propagation structures. And again, these are structures that our plants develop and grow that allow them to reproduce asexually, right? To create clones of themselves. And we're able to tap into them to propagate. So that is that. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will see you with the next lecture.